Okay, so we're going to move on and talk about the cell lines that are produced in the bone marrow. The red blood cell line, the white blood cell line, and the platelets. Okay, so think of those three cell lines and think of what their main role is. Red blood cells, uh, oxygen carrying capacity in the blood. White blood cells, inflammation and immunity for the body. Platelets, the initial formation of a platelet plug to stop a capillary or a blood vessel that's bleeding. Okay? Okay, so we're going to talk about stem cells in terms of the bone marrow in a minute. But a stem cell can develop into any cell. Okay, and there's a lot of research going on about this. Stem cells can be grown, and depending on what you want, you could potentially grow a neuron, a skin cell, a cartilage cell, a red blood cell, a fat cell, a digestive enterocyte, which is a cell in your gastrointestinal tract, or a cardiac cell. So stem cells within the body have the potential really to become anything. And stem cells are heavily researched to see if different cells can be produced and make tissue, such as cardiac tissue or epithelial tissue for grafts. So just know that the concept of a stem cell is that it has the potential to be any other type of cell. Okay? Okay, so this slide is on hematopoiesis. So hematopoiesis is the production of the different cell lines within the bone marrow. Okay? And it's the spongy part of the bone marrow. It's not the cancellous hard part of the bone marrow. Okay? Where hematopoiesis takes place. So you have a stem cell, a blood stem cell at the top there, and it can divide into a myeloid stem cell or a lymphoid stem cell. Okay? The lymphoid stem cells, well, they all become lymphocytes. And there's one that becomes what's called a natural killer cell, but we'll just concentrate. They become B lymphocytes and T lymphocytes. Okay? What about the myeloid stem cell? Okay, well, that's where you're going to get red blood cells that can form, platelets can form. They initially become a megakaryocyte first, and then platelets break off the megakaryocyte. And then you get your other white blood cell types, right, which are called your granulocytes. And they're just called granulocytes because when we look at them, we can see granules within them. And those are your neutrophils, eosinophils, and basophils. Okay? So your B and T lymphocytes, your lymphocytes actually don't have any granulocytes when we look at them under a microscope. Okay, so this image is just showing you red blood cells, and they truly are amazing. Okay, so they have what's called a biconcave shape, and this really allows them to circulate through the arteries, the capillaries, and then back into the veins without being destroyed. They're very flexible. They have a lot of give, and they're not easily destroyed. Now we're going to talk about conditions where red blood cells are either too large or they have an odd shape. Well, those get destroyed when they're going through small capillaries because they don't fit through properly, right? So this perfect shape for a red blood cell allows it to get through blood vessels, even tiny capillaries, without being damaged and deliver its oxygen to the tissues and then continue on into the venous system. Okay, red blood cell facts and information. So, so reticulocytes are actually immature red blood cells. They're part of the maturation process of red blood cells. Okay? So if we see reticulocytes in the bloodstream, it means that red blood cells somewhere in the bloodstream are being destroyed. And the bone marrow is releasing reticulocytes into the bloodstream because it's sensing that the red blood cells are being destroyed quickly. Okay? So remember, reticulocytes are immature red blood cells, and if they're elevated in the bloodstream, it's because there's some kind of red blood cell breakdown occurring in the bloodstream. Okay? Red blood cells do not have a nucleus when they're circulating in the blood. Okay? Now, what about the breakdown products of red blood cells? So we mentioned before that red blood cells are broken down in the spleen. Okay, well, what are they broken down to? Well, they're broken down initially into their globin groups, which are the proteins. So those 4 globin groups that I mentioned, each hemoglobin has 4 units. It's broken down into the heme group, which is what carries the iron. And then finally, the heme, well, the iron is redistributed back into the bloodstream. The globin is just protein, so the liver can take that back and recycle it and make and break it down to amino acids to make other proteins. The heme gets broken down in the liver to produce bilirubin. And bilirubin, which is the breakdown product of heme, which comes from the red blood cells, is that yellow color that we see in jaundice. So bilirubin is the breakdown product of red blood cells. Where does it take place? In the liver. When the liver is not functioning normally, such as in hepatitis or cirrhosis, the bilirubin backs up into the bloodstream, and we get jaundiced, right? And typically we see it in the whites of people's eyes because they look yellow. Okay, so so we spoke about where the red blood cells are destroyed and broken down in the spleen. Where does the heme convert to bilirubin? In the liver. Where does the iron go? It gets recycled to be used again. Where do the protein globin units go? They get recycled again because they're just proteins. Okay. So anemia is when the overall red blood cell content of your blood is low for whatever reason. So whether you're not making enough red blood cells or you're destroying red blood cells in the circulation or you're losing blood, whichever one it is, and we'll go into many examples, that would be anemia. Okay. So how do we find out if someone's anemic? Well, with a CBC, right? A CBC tells us the hematocrit, which is that percentage in the test tube, which is red blood cells. It tells us the red blood cell count per volume. It tells us the hemoglobin level. And of course, we get a white blood cell count and a platelet level on a CBC. Okay. Okay, so we'll come back to red blood cell breakdown in a future slide. Not too long from now, okay? But let's just talk about red blood cell production, erythropoiesis. Okay, that's the production of red blood cells. And so where does this take place? Well, it takes place in the bone marrow, right? And you have a stem cell. And we call these stem cells pluripotent stem cells or pluripotential stem cells. It's the same as saying a stem cell. It has the potential to be any type of cell. Okay. Now, with the stimulation of erythropoietin from the kidneys, it will commit a stem cell to an immature red blood cell. Okay. And finally, as the red blood cell matures, it will be gradually released into the circulation. Okay, so at the reticulocyte stage, which is still an immature red blood cell, it can leave um, the bone marrow and enter the bloodstream and achieve its final shape. Okay, that is filled with hemoglobin and has full oxygen carrying capacity normally. Okay, so we always have a few reticulocytes circulating in our bloodstream. I don't want you to get the idea that we don't have any reticulocytes, but reticulocyte counts are elevated when the bone marrow is moving out red blood cells prematurely. It's moving it out because it's sensing that blood is either being broken down too fast in the bloodstream, or there's ongoing blood loss, and the bone marrow responds by having reticulocytes leave the bone marrow early to try and compensate. Okay, and we get what's called a reticulocytosis, meaning an elevation of the red blood cells. Okay. Okay, so regulation of erythropoiesis, so regulation of red blood cell production. Well, we know that the main form of regulation is hypoxia in the bloodstream, which is going to stimulate the release of erythropoietin from the kidneys, and after release of erythropoietin, it will go to the bone marrow and stimulate red blood cell production. Okay, so it'll stimulate the red cell line to increase hemoglobin levels, increase red blood cell count, and increase hematocrit, right? So that's the role of erythropoietin. So know the sequence from hypoxia to release of erythropoietin to stimulation of the bone marrow to produce more red cells, and finally elevation of hemoglobin or circulating red blood cells in the bloodstream. Okay, so in a male patient who had an intraoperative hemorrhage 12 hours ago, the nurse would expect to find hematology results indicating which? Okay, intraoperative hemorrhage 12 hours ago. So, well, a hematocrit of 45% is normal. A hemoglobin of 13.2 is slightly low, but still, it's not terribly. It's either it's a very small hemorrhage and the hemoglobin is reduced a bit, but that's just slightly below normal, right? So let's go to C. A decreased white blood cell count. No, that shouldn't happen, right? We're talking about red blood cells here and hemorrhaging, so an elevated reticulocyte count. Okay, so I lost blood, and the bone marrow sensed that I was losing blood, and it didn't want me to become deficient in red blood cells, so it moved out reticulocytes into the bloodstream, and now when I test the blood, it has an elevated reticulocyte count, so it's going to be that one. Okay, so it's D. Okay, so let's look at the building blocks that are needed to produce normal red blood cells. Okay, so first off, we need vitamins. And the vitamins that we need are vitamin B12 and folic acid. Okay, so they have to be in proper normal amounts in the bloodstream and in the bone marrow to produce red blood cells. We also need certain minerals, and in particular, we need iron. We do need copper, but iron is the main one that's required for erythropoiesis. And lastly, we need proteins, right? Those globin groups that we'll see on another slide, they're made up of proteins, okay? So general nutrition by ingesting proteins, which are really just long strings of amino acids, they're required to synthesize the globin groups of hemoglobin. Okay, so vitamins, minerals, in particular iron, and of course the proteins. And if either one of these is lacking, so if you're deficient in iron or you're deficient in B12 or folic acid, you're going to develop a certain type of anemia. Okay, and we'll talk about the different types of anemia. Okay, so here's the structure of hemoglobin. So you have 4 globin groups, so 2 alpha chains and 2 beta chains, and they're the protein. They're made of protein, right? And then you have the heme group, and in the center of heme is your iron, and that's where oxygen binds. And so a hemoglobin molecule can bind 4 oxygens, since there's 4 heme groups as the binding site. Okay, and this is just a continuation of the slide above. So we have hemoglobin A in us as adults, right? So the 2 alpha and the 2 beta globin groups make up hemoglobin. So there's 4 subunits, which can carry 4 molecules of oxygen on each hemoglobin. A red blood cell has about 300 hemoglobin molecules. Okay, so so that's an important concept to remember in terms of there's 4 protein groups, 2 alpha, 2 beta. There's a heme group in each one that has an iron molecule in the center, and that's where oxygen binds, allowing 4 oxygen molecules to bind to hemoglobin. Okay? The heme is basically, you can think of it as a ring-like compound called porphyrin, and that is exactly where the iron atom can attach to, okay, within the heme group. Okay, so let's go back to the life cycle of a red blood cell of about 120 days for a healthy red blood cell. So in the top left-hand corner, well, even before that, at the bone marrow, we have release of red blood cells. So a small amount of reticulocytes, and then mostly mature red blood cells. And once it's time for them to be destroyed, it typically takes place in the spleen. And Kupffer cells are just a fancy name for a phagocyte. So in the spleen, we can call them Kupffer cells. Okay? And they destroy the red blood cells, the old ones, and break them down. And so what does hemoglobin break down to? Well, it breaks down to the globin proteins, which then get recycled in the liver to make other proteins, right? They get broken down to amino acids, and the amino acids then can be used for production of another type of protein. And then the heme group, well, that still has the iron on it, and the iron just gets recycled in the body to make more red blood cells. And then the heme, which is that porphyrin ring I was talking about, it gets converted partly in the spleen and mostly in the liver to bilirubin. And bilirubin can then become bile. And bile is secreted or excreted by the liver and stored in the gallbladder and also released into the small intestine for digestion of fats, right? It's actually an emulsifier. So bile can mix with fats, and they mix together, they emulsify, and then lipases can break down the fats that you've eaten much more easily with bile present. Okay? I mentioned before, if the liver is failing, this process cannot occur, and bilirubin doesn't get processed properly in the liver, and it backs up into the bloodstream, causing jaundice, right? That yellow color of our skin and our eyes. Bile, actually, that's secreted into the gastrointestinal tract is what gives your stool its brown color. Bile is just a pigment. So that pigment is what gives stool its brown color. Okay? Now, a lot of bile, by the way, that's secreted into the gastrointestinal tract can then be reabsorbed once it's finished emulsifying fats. It can be reabsorbed by the end of the small intestine, called the ileum, and some of it gets reused by the liver. So it's a very efficient process. The globins get reused, the iron gets reused, the heme becomes bilirubin, and that gets used for fat digestion, and even some of the bile, which is being used for fat digestion and emulsification. Some of that gets reabsorbed, but some of it stays in your stool and gives it its color. Okay, so this is just another image showing you a very similar process, right? So at the bottom, you see the bloodstream heading towards the spleen. Okay, what happens to those old, abnormal, damaged red blood cells, the erythrocytes? Well, those Kupffer cells, those macrophages in the spleen, partly in the liver, they will break it down into its subunits, right? Which is the globin and the heme. The heme releases its iron, the heme becomes bilirubin, and bilirubin will become bile in the liver. Okay? So it's very circular in terms of reusing the iron, reusing the globins because they're just amino acids, and then actually the heme becoming bilirubin that then becomes bile to be secreted by the liver. Okay, so let's look a bit at iron metabolism, because we need iron to have normal red blood cells. Okay, so where do we get our iron from? Well, we get it in our diet, such as in meats. We can get iron in supplements as well. Okay, and how is the iron transferred around the bloodstream? Well, remember, the body likes to transfer things with proteins, or it likes to bind things with proteins. It doesn't like just things floating around in its bloodstream without a chauffeur. And so in the bloodstream, there's a protein called transferrin, and it transfers iron to where it needs to go, right? So if it goes to the right, well, it can go to the bone marrow and produce red blood cells. If the transferrin goes to the left in this image, it can be stored, right? The iron can be stored, that is. And where is iron stored? Well, typically in the liver, and it's stored with a protein called ferritin. So when we do a blood test, sure, we can check your iron levels in your bloodstream, but what's even more accurate is to do a ferritin blood test. And if your ferritin is normal in your bloodstream, it means you have proper amounts of storage of iron in the different parts of your body, such as bone marrow, liver, spleen. Okay, so we do serum ferritins to check if you have normal amounts of iron in your body. Okay, now at the bottom, the recycling process we spoke about, where red blood cells get recycled. They get destroyed if they're old by macrophages in the liver and spleen. And where does the iron go? It can be reused by the bone marrow to make more red blood cells. It can be stored in the liver or the spleen. So iron is really important to be ingested, but you can see that the body reuses the iron over and over again in the production of red blood cells. Okay, and it has fantastic ability to store iron with a molecule called ferritin, which is a protein.